Hi, everyone. So this is our course video for this week instead of meeting in person. The agenda for today, we're going to go through how to do some deep analysis. I'm going to talk a few last words on coding. We're going to go over memoing and then how to turn codes into themes. And then finally, how to put your methods in past tense. You should be watching this video probably when you're about 3/4 of the way through your coding. So you should probably be at least halfway through and maybe close to finishing before watching this video. So one thing I want to ask you, and maybe you can just comment on the bottom of this YouTube video, is how is coding going? How's it going for you? Are you having fun? What things are challenging? I'm interested in that if you want to post a comment or a question. All right, I want to start right off with talking about close analysis of one excerpt. So just start off the bat, of course, a research question, because the research question guides everything. How are participants making sense of new information and policies regarding science education? All right, and this is should be familiar to you. This excerpt is from something I've been talking about. Sometimes you want to take a really juicy piece of text from your interview or whatever else, your observation, and code it really deeply. So you want to really dig in and be like, well, what all is going on in this excerpt? So that's what we'll do here. And I recommend that you do that occasionally. In fact, I recommend that for every code, you choose one excerpt that you really dig into and see what's going on. All right, so in this one, teacher Annie says, next year we can still be figuring things out. And Nick says, they need to get started. And admin Margaret says, right, the 3rd, 6th, and 9th graders, I think next year we really just will work with as many 6th grade teachers as we can and getting them to just start getting really messy and doing as much stuff as possible. And so again, back to my research question, I'm interested in how participants are making sense of new information and policies regarding science education. So my deep analysis of this one excerpt is that participants seem to be drawing on knowledge from various levels of the organization, including the TOSA, the teachers, and administrators, right? Because teacher Annie brings something in, the facilitator brings something in, that's Nick, and then the admin brings something in. Using that knowledge, they're trying to develop a timeline for district implementation. However, their plan is not very concrete. And then I even put some quotes from the excerpt, still figuring things out, start getting really messy, right? So this was a deep analysis of one excerpt. And again, I really recommend using your theory and your research question that you dive in to some of your excerpts and do that. And that actually starts to, in many cases, it starts to show more codes. So select a particularly juicy, intriguing excerpt and do a close analysis or interpretation. And then as you interpret it, try to pick out small bits, words, and quotes. This is sort of a linguistic analysis, or even some people might call it a discourse analysis. So what do people mean by different, if they use the word, I'm thinking, I think, what does that imply about cognition? If they use the word maybe or somewhat or messy or what does that imply about the process they're talking about? If they use the word, analyzed one excerpt that was a principal was saying, I feel under the gun. It's just I just feel like being whipped into shape by accountability, right? Those words really imply a particular emotional state around accountability. So I was digging into that. Okay, so I recommend you pause the video here and actually go try it out. And I will get back with you as soon as you're done. You can unpause it. Okay, so you've obviously already done a deep analysis of one excerpt. You've seen what it can do, and I'm going to move on and give a few more hints about coding. So number one, some of you might have this question, what about subcodes? You have this overarching code, resources people use in sense making. But then there's subcodes like drawing on the knowledge of the TOSA, understanding about policy, understanding about the district context, right? So every code can have subcodes. You can go as deep as you want. It can get a little complicated, but I often have quite a number of layers of subcodes. So if I'm looking at a sense of teacher motivation from professional learning, from participating in professional development, I might have several subcodes that have to do with teachers feeling like the professional learning opportunity treats them as a real human being, that they feel like their real work context is being acknowledged by the professional learning providers, right? Those are subcodes. You also may apply 2 codes to one excerpt, and I do that actually quite a lot. So you can see in this example from Saldana that, Mrs. Jackson rises up from her desk and announces, okay, guys, let's get lined up for lunch. Row 1, 5 children seated in the first row rise and walk to the classroom door. Some of the seated children talk to each other. Mrs. Jackson looks at them and says, no talking, save it for the cafeteria. So simultaneously, for his coding, this was lining up for lunch and managing behavior, right? Because both those things were happening simultaneously, all right? And you can also see, I want to point out that this is an observational excerpt. So this is being coded just like an interview in this case. All right, other final advice. If you're using deductive coding, that means you are applying a theoretical framework or a set of codes from your literature to your data. Be sure to be open to emergent ideas and divergent explanations and negative examples. So you might have a set of things from the literature that you're like, well, according to the literature, administrators of special education behave in these ways. They're lacking in knowledge about special education. They struggle to build relationships between special ed teachers and general ed teachers, and they find it very important to follow the law of idea, but they don't always understand it. Okay, so maybe that's out in the literature. And so you have those as codes, but something arising from your literature is that administrators really need to understand something's arising from your data. So something might be arising from your data that teachers actually feel supported by administrators, even if administrators don't fully understand the law. So that's an emergent idea that you need to provide space for in your coding. Now, if you're using very deeply inductive coding, so if you're looking at in vivo codes, for example, be aware that that may not also be perfect because we always have theory, right? We have analytical lens. So for example, many of us are critically oriented. We have our positionality. So there's always theory, even if it's not necessarily academic theory, underlying our choices. These influence your research design, the questions you ask in an interview, and your coding, and it's important to acknowledge that. The other thing about in vivo is that relying too heavily on in vivo coding can limit your ability to analyze conceptually and relate it to the prior literature. So if everything is just this participant words, it's like, well, how does this actually kind of relate back to any other literature? So sometimes you have to extract it a little bit, one level above. Okay, I want to just kind of step aside for a moment and talk about purpose. 2 important things to keep in mind as you are doing your coding. One is thinking about practice. Like, after all, you are all practitioners out doing amazing work. You're researcher practitioners. And so as you code, you can make memos that are like, oh, this would be a great way to address such and such challenge in my teaching. Oh, from these students, coding what these students said, I realized I need to approach my work with teachers in a different way. And this is what I should do. Or maybe all administrators should approach their work with teachers in a different way, or whatever, right? And the other thing, of course, is social justice. Always have the ideas of equity and social justice in the back of your mind. Thinking about who has voice and who has power in any given situation. So you might be doing an observation where there's some clear power differentials. Are there voices or people who are not represented in any given room or any situation or any given data set? And are there ways in which certain types of knowledge are valued and other types of knowledge are not? And that's something that happens quite a lot, where you might be interviewing someone who maybe discounts, for example, you might be interviewing someone who discounts the knowledge that a parent brings to the table, who happens to be an immigrant, right? They may not overtly do so, but sometimes it's under the surface, this like, well, what they have to add and what they have to offer is not as valuable per se as maybe an English speaking parent or a wealthy parent. So keep on the lookout for that sort of thing. All right, so the next part that we're going to talk about is about defining your codes and moving them into themes. So this is what happens towards the middle to end of your coding. I usually like to define my codes during the coding process. So about halfway through, I start defining my codes. Then to move them into themes and so forth, I do that through the latter half of my coding process. And it's an iterative process. So it doesn't just happen once. I define my codes, I go back, do some more coding, redefine, do some more coding, redefine. And the same with putting them into themes. I group them into themes. I might say, this one doesn't belong, put it into a different theme, that kind of thing over time. All right. Now, there's a graphic organizer available to you to use to do this process. You should definitely use it. There's also an example in the graphic organizer I'm going to go over during this presentation. All right. So you'll want to start with a list of the codes you have been using. You should be importing these into an Excel or a Word table. And you should create this and the preliminary definitions as you go along. So take a particular code and you want to gather all of the excerpts for that one code into one place. So you can copy and paste them into a Word doc. You can cut them. For those of you who like things tangible, you can cut them out. And I glued them when I was doing research pre-electronic. I glued them on little cards so that they're all together. So you should have like 20 or 30 or 40 for each code. Then you read through all of those excerpts, right? So you say, okay, if this is my code for students feeling like suspension is unfair. Okay, so maybe that's the code, is unfair. I have all these different excerpts. You know, one student might be saying, well, it's stupid because, you know, it's not fair if someone misses school. And another kid might be saying, well, it just seems like the teacher's unfair and who she singles out or whatever. All right. So you have all these things together, read through all the excerpts and say, first of all, go, okay, is there any that actually need to be taken out or need to have a different code? Because some of them will be coded, you know, not the correct way. And the other question you ask yourself is, do I want to break into any subcodes? So for example, if you have like 50 excerpts under one code, you will really want to think about subcodes because obviously there's probably several things happening in that giant data set. All right. Then you should write a preliminary definition based on those excerpts. So I'm going to show you in the graphic organizer. Okay, so here's a graphic organizer. You will have this. It has all the directions just for you, and it has an example. All right, so you can see the code, you can see the definition, and then you will do these other steps. So here's the code, opportunity for PD. I define that as a reference to opportunities for science-specific professional development, not lesson studies. So you can see here, there's often boundaries within your definition. So you want to remind yourself, anything having to do with lesson study is going in a different code. And then I refer back to the literature. The literature seems to denote a continuum of professional development from one shot to more extensive, intensive PD. So I'm implying that maybe as I put excerpts into this bucket, that there might end up being a continuum of types of PD. All right. Another code with a definition is scheduling for science PD and collaboration time. And in that case, I said scheduling issues or overcoming of scheduling issues related to professional development or collaboration time. There's very little literature in this area. This may be a gap, right? So I'm referring back to the literature. Okay, back to the slideshow. All right, so after you write your definition, you'll look up the literature and think about, well, what is the relationship between the literature and my definition of the code? And I don't want you to just plop something from the literature on top of your code. I want you to define for yourself what that code means and then say, okay, in what ways does this code relate back to the literature? And it might relate to it fairly well. It might have areas that it doesn't relate to, all right? Then, following that, cut and paste 1 to 3 exemplar quotes into the cell on the right side of the definition. So look through all those 20 quotes that you've cut out and go, okay, what's the best quote to represent this code? Or what are some of the best quotes? Because those are going to be your evidence when you go to write up that code. So those quotes, they need to exactly show what you're talking about with that code. All right. So now back to the graphic organizer. So you can see here with these 2 codes, I have put some evidence from the interview. So for the opportunity for PD, I put a quote, "We have consistently asked for more professional development and collaboration time," right? So that's this teacher talking about whether there were opportunities for PD. And you will want to put more than 1. You will need to put 2 or 3. Okay, now notice that I've clumped these codes into themes. There's 2 codes under the theme professional development, opportunities for PD and scheduling of science PD. All right. I have another theme, district or state policies, and that has a couple of examples, No Child Left Behind and coring issues. And each one of these has a definition and some example quotes. So you can see here, here's the definition for No Child Left Behind. And then there's example quotes that I think are a really good illustration of that theme. All right. So this is what you'll be doing with a graphic organizer. Again, just to go over the steps, get all of your excerpts in one place, write a definition for that code, relate it back to the literature, choose several excerpts that are really good illustrations for that code. Now, the other piece of this graphic organizer is you're going to write some memos. And I'm going to go back to the slides to demonstrate how to do that. Okay. So first of all, before talking about memos, and I already showed you this in the organizer, experiment with putting codes into categories or themes. So, you know, where codes should lump together, right? And then, and this is sort of moving into memoing, summarize what you learned from your participants regarding each theme. So what did you learn as you looked through all those excerpts? As you read through, you might have like a sense of the pattern. Like, what are the patterns you see going on here? So maybe back to the discipline example, if you're like, oh, there's all these different ways students talk about discipline being unfair. So your memo might be regarding the patterns you see. Maybe some students maybe the pattern is about emotions. Some students appear to be fairly angry about it, while other students appear to be fairly blasé about it. Like, this doesn't affect me, so I don't care, right? So like maybe there's a couple different things going on in the data there. Okay, so that's one way to write a memo is you recognize a pattern. You look through all your excerpts and you recognize a pattern. There's lots of other things you might want to write about in memos. And memos are super important because as you write them, you are essentially writing your findings. Memos become the groundwork of your findings. So essentially it's to document any emergent pattern that you notice, all right? And there's a chapter in Saldana about this. What you notice about participants, about phenomena, process, relationships between codes, everything. They're your reflections on the data. So they can pertain to your research question. They can pertain to the literature. You might be connecting back up to the literature. It might be about the definition of a code as it arises. It might be patterns you see across data. It might be relationships between codes. And it might be future things that you want to write about, okay? You should write your memos all the time. So it starts the minute you start transcribing your data, when you're analyzing data, and when you're writing up the findings. Otherwise, because you'll have these brilliant thoughts. I know you will, because I know you're super awesome. And if you don't write them down, if you're like, oh, like I see this thing in the data, I see this thing students are talking about, or, you know, whoever I'm interviewing is talking about, that's so interesting, or that's so surprising. If you do not write that down, it is going to be gone. Later on, you're going to be like, man, I wish I could remember that thing. If you don't have time to write it down, record it on your phone. Make voice memos about what you're seeing and what you're hearing as you do your interviews and as you code your data, okay? So I'm going to give you some examples. A metaphorical memo, all right? This district might be represented by a metaphor of permeable membranes like cells between levels. They allow some things to go through and others not. Some things are allowed through one way, but not others. Communication, resources, respect. This is sort of me thinking about, like, how would I characterize this district, right? Another memo, this is talking about a particular example excerpt. And this might be one of those deep dive things. This excerpt provides an interesting example of how a principal's being overwhelmed by PI status results, that's program improvement and accountability, results in delegation of authority to competent science teachers. This may be a good thing in that science teacher experts are able to develop local policy, but appears to also disrupt district leadership structure and communication and result in teacher and coach frustration. So there was a lot of stuff in the excerpt that allowed me to really think about, like, oh, you know, there's something going on here. And there was kind of a pattern that led up to this. Now here's a pattern memo. Initially, the district is more focused on Common Core, but now they're starting to spread some of their focus to science, specifically NGSS. So that was based on a lot of excerpts that I saw, like people talking about, we used to just only be about Common Core, but it seems like some people are talking about NGSS now. So multiple people said that, and I wrote kind of a pattern memo. Then there's a memo that connects to the literature. So in this case, I wrote, this is an excellent example of symbolic implementation of these initiatives. And Coburn came up with this idea of symbolic implementation in 2004. So I'm referencing her. And then later, as I write up these findings, I'll go back and it's great. I already know this is Coburn and this is related to the literature. Okay, so back to the graphic organizer. So you can see here that I've written a memo, and I'd like you to do the same thing. We've got our definition, we've got our evidence, and then the memo, I'm like writing a little bit about what I'm seeing. I'm actually writing memos across both codes. It pertains to the theme. And he was referring to what the teachers most often ask for to support science education reform. Not only was it mentioned frequently in the interview, but she indicated that without it, there would be little reform. So I'm making an indication to myself that across a lot of interviews, teachers asked for support for science education reform, all right? And I'm saying the teachers think there's a consequence to not having professional development, which is that reform's not gonna happen, all right? And then the second memo says, in order to build the resources supports needed for science PD, one principal leveraged his relationship with other principals, working with them to change all three school schedules to align release dates. Knowing how to sell such a major initiative, major revision, clearly required social capital and leadership skill. So I'm really connecting to the theoretical literature here, right? Social capital, this is Bourdieu, leadership skill, this is various folks who write about leadership. So I'm taking these two quotes as an example, and I'm unpacking them to show a particular process that was going on. All right, here's a memo for accountability and the policies. Accountability and Common Core are primarily described as degrading, undermining, and blocking efforts to establish science education reform. So notice here, again, I'm extracting back to the whole pattern across all of the excerpts. And then I give an example. For example, accountability in combination with high poverty led to numerous non-science initiatives and district efforts to get out of program improvement. All right, so that's a more specific example. So I think you can see here how the memos fit in. This then can become, I mean, literally I can cut and paste this into my findings section, right? I might even have one section of my findings titled district or state policies. And then I literally cut and paste this piece into that. And then I use some example quotes, right? So my findings are writing themselves in this graphic organizer, okay? Now, feel free to pause this video if you want to go do some work. I'm gonna get back to the slides, and I'm gonna do one more thing before we're done, which is to get into the how to write your methods in past tense, which you need to do before you turn in all your revisions. Oh, there's deduce. Okay, let's see. Methods revisions. So you revise your methods to do your study. Now, as you do your analysis, you need to revise your methods to document what you did. It's going to be in past tense. So before it was like a proposal, I will do this, I will do that. Now you've already collected your data, so you're going to write about specifically what happened, and you're going to need to make changes, not just put it in past tense, because now you know exactly who you talked to and what happened. And of course, what happened was not what you planned to happen for most of you, because that's just how research goes, right? So you could have planned to have done some sort of great, interview where everyone was willing to be recorded, but it turned out only 2 people were willing to be recorded. So that's who you interviewed, right? So here's an example. Before the study, you might have written, in this study, focus group interviews of teachers and administrators across 4 districts will help refine the research question and provide an overview of elementary science implementation across 4 contexts, right? This is from my dissertation, by the way. Then afterwards, you can be very specific. Participant districts were chosen through a purposive sampling procedure guided by literature that suggested accountability pressure drives differential organizational response. You can see their citations there. 3 districts were selected within Northern California to represent a high poverty context, a district with wide poverty distribution, and a low poverty context. Because so now I'd already selected my district, so I could give very specific exactly why I selected my districts, exactly how I selected my districts, and exactly what they were. All right. And of course, this is not the only thing in the methods. I went on to give the demographics and to talk about everything that happened. Okay. So feel free to watch this video over and over again and to pause, of course, obviously at appropriate times, because I know there's a lot of material here. And I look forward to seeing you later.